In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Those are the words that end the book of Judges. The era of Judges was rotten. It's full of violence and oppression for hundreds of years. Generations of God's people have to live under the threat from outsiders. They're in constant danger. And while individual judges provide a temporary relief, what people long for is a king. Because as long as they have no king, each person feels it's their responsibility to do what is right in their own eyes. So picture a classroom full of students, but with no teacher. All the students gather for class, but no teacher shows up. So what's going to happen? The kid's going to sit and do nothing? Are they going to talk to their friends? Is somebody going to be brave enough to stand up and try to teach from the front of the classroom? Are the kids supposed to be listening, but yet they do the things they're not supposed to do? Or what happens? Do some leave? One thing's for sure, the classroom without a teacher isn't going to be intact for long. And I say that from experience, because when I was a junior in high school, don't copy your pastor in all things. When I was a junior in high school, our English teacher was late to class. We didn't know if she was going to show up. And we were in a first floor classroom with a window to the outside. And this guy organized a jailbreak. So in case the teacher was coming down the hall, we didn't want her to see us leaving. So this guy popped open the window, pried the screen off, and we left. We hid. And then when the teacher did show up, about 20 minutes later, who knows what she was up to, we were gone. And we all got in trouble for it. Because that's what happens. In a classroom with no teacher, the students do what's right in their own eyes, and often it's the wrong thing. People don't do well without authority. God's people don't thrive without a king any more than a classroom of students thrives without a teacher. So in this next chapter of God's history, in the great big story of the Bible, God's people demand a king. It happens in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 8. Up to this point, God's people had been led by hand-picked leaders, family figureheads like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. God's special rescuers like Moses and Aaron and Joshua, or righteous judges like Deborah or Gideon or Samuel. And it's that last fella, Samuel, that gets our attention, because Samuel was not just a judge. He was raised from childhood to be a priest, someone whose first job it was to serve Yahweh. After that, he would lead God's people. His priorities were God first, then leading God's people. But Samuel wouldn't live forever. Samuel hoped that his sons would be the righteous rulers that God's people needed. But it turns out that Samuel's sons were just like those others, people who did what was right in their own eyes. And unsatisfied, God's people said, no more of this leader to leader to leader stuff. We want the stability that a king provides. So what qualities do you think the people of Israel were looking for in their king? Strength, or fairness, or wisdom, or reliability, goodness, or integrity? Well, this is what it says in 1 Samuel chapter 8. I'm reading verses 4 and 5. It says, Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, Behold, Samuel, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us, just like all the other nations. The people of God cry out for a king, but did you notice what they asked for? They asked for a king to judge us, just like all the other nations. They want the same kind of leader that they saw all the other nations have. Now remember, the other nations are Israel's enemies. They fight and attack them, and Israel says, we want a king like those guys have. We want a king who takes care of us. We want a king who puts us and our protection first. We want a king who's strong and fights for our safety. We want a king whose number one priority isn't God, but it's them. just like all the other nations have. And this hurts Samuel's heart. In verses 6 and 7, it said, "But the thing they said displeased Samuel. And when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us,' Samuel prayed to the Lord, and Yahweh said to Samuel, 'Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they've not rejected you, Samuel, but they've rejected me from being the king over them.'" God's people ask for a king because they don't realize they already have a king. God's people ask for a king with a lowercase k because they don't realize they already have a capital K king. Their king is Yahweh, God Himself. They're not rejecting you, Samuel, Yahweh says. They're rejecting me. God's people already had a king who took care of them, a king who prioritizes their safety and protection, a king who's strong and fights for His people. There's no one stronger than God Himself. And this is His covenant people, His most treasured possession. And they say, "No, we want to be like all the other nations." It can be easy to forget how special we are, that you and I have been called to be God's covenant people through our baptism, that we have a capital K king, and that king is God Himself, the king who takes care of us, the king who fights for us. But we can wish to be like all the other nations, like everybody else, all the other people who live their lives doing what's right in their own eyes, not following God's rules, not doing things His way. But we, you and I, have a capital K king. He's the God who created the world. He's the God who went to the cross. He's the God who's coming back for us. And sometimes we forget. Sometimes we wish to be just like everybody else. You know what happens in the Bible when God's people ask for a king? God gives them one. They get a king, just like all the other nations. And they're told from the beginning, this isn't going to go well, because now you're putting your trust in an earthly king, just another human being, putting your trust in an earthly king over the heavenly king who proves His love for you, rescues you over and over, and surrounds you with His promises. They get a king, and his name is Saul.